My name is Matt Bowker, and I manage Rhodes Scholars Virtual Lecture Series, and it's my pleasure to host today's lecture. And today, you will be hearing from Bob Wolz. Bob Wolz is the Executive Director of the Harry S. Truman Little White House in Key West. He is an accomplished writer, having co-authored or edited several books, including Presidents in Paradise. His work has also appeared in the Florida Artland History Magazine and the American Political Science Review.
Thank you. I'm really honored today to get to take you to my favorite hometown of Key West, Florida. On the screen at the moment is a picture of the Truman Little White House. Hopefully some of you have been there. And we are very proud of the fact that we are included in all Rhodes Scholar programs to Key West. This is a 9,000 square foot historic house museum, furnished in about 85 to 95% original furnishings that were purchased for President Truman back in 1949. To be very honest with you, I was named director 20 years ago, and at that time I knew very little about Harry Truman. It was a learning experience, and the more you know about Harry, the better he looks. I'm very honored to tell you that he is indeed someone who may have changed the world. President Truman was advanced to the presidency, of course, upon the death of Franklin Roosevelt, and that is on April 12th of 1945. President Truman, future President Truman, was at the Senate. He received a call, as the Vice President of the United States, he received a call from the White House asking him to go to the White House, and was informed by Mrs. Truman of the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Harry felt like the entire world had fallen upon him. He had no idea that he would ever be President of the United States. So let's look a little bit about how this guy became the person that he becomes. Harry was an avid reader. Here's a picture of him when he's about 10 years old, maybe 11. And he was living in the town of Independence, Missouri. His mother had pushed the issue to get better schools for her children. So her husband had moved to Independence from a little town called Lamar, Missouri. And Harry becomes an avid reader. They discovered he had poor eyesight, so they purchased those little spectacles he's wearing. And to be very honest about it, he admits he had to sit on the sidelines most of his life. He brags that he had read every book in the Independence, Missouri library. I believe we would call that political spin today, because I really think he concentrated on histories and biographies. And we also know that he read the Bible several times cover to cover, as well as the complete works of Shakespeare. One of the many things that future President Truman said was, "Reading history to me was more than a romantic adventure. It was solid instruction and wise teaching, which I somehow felt I wanted and needed." The fact that he was such an avid reader, he understood the value of history. One of his favorite quotes is, "Not all readers will be leaders, but all leaders must be readers." He graduated from high school, unlike many of his peers that dropped out at the 8th grade. And as such, he had several jobs, as all young men do, always though trying to advance, always trying to improve himself. And his mother called him back to the farm when he was about 20 years old. He had to give up his city life and return to the farm. Harry Truman felt farming was a very necessary thing, and that every president of the United States should be a farmer, because among other things, it teaches you that hard work alone is no guarantee for success. With the advent of World War I, Harry Truman goes to Kansas City and applies to the National Guard. Sadly, he fails the physical miserably. He can't read the eye chart. 2 weeks later, he comes back, passes with flying colors. Now, it was not a miraculous cure, but instead, he had memorized the eye chart. Well, this unit is an artillery unit, horse-drawn, and consisted of predominantly hard-drinking Irishmen, Roman Catholic in faith. Harry was a Baptist, their army clerk, Eddie Jacobson, a Jew. And other than that, they were all these hard-drinking Irishmen. They made it overseas to the Battle of the Argonne. And when the Germans located their position, the men panicked, the horses panicked. Harry Truman mounted his horse, got control of the situation, led by example, and his men truly, I'm sorry, I'm behind the slide, his men truly fell in love with Harry. His unit came home largely unscathed. He had been elected by the men as their lieutenant. In those days, advancement was granted on merit, and so he retires from the unit as a captain, but he stays in the Missouri National Guard until 1938 and has the rank of colonel. Well, unfortunately for Harry, he gets involved in politics. He is a county commissioner. As such, he gets, well, really not as much credit as he deserves. He was got elected by the political boss of Kansas City. His name was Tom Pendergast. All cities, large and small, had political bosses in those days. And so while today we can look down our nose and say, oh, this is a terrible corruption, the reality was almost all cities, large and small, Republican or Democrat, had political bosses, and there was a certain amount of graft involved. The future President Harry Truman, as the county commissioner, built 2 courthouses, reduced the county debt by $1 million, and was very successful as a county commissioner. After about 8 years as county commissioner, he strove for something a little more challenging. He was elected to the United States Senate in 1934, and as a United States Senator, is selected by the Democratic Party to run as their vice presidential candidate. It seems that Henry Wallace was leaning way, way to the left. Jimmy Burns would like to be the vice president. He wants but he wants to lean further to the right. Truman was looked upon as a simple space filler. Surely Roosevelt would live out his 4th term, retire to Hyde Park and write his memoirs. And at that point, probably in 1948, a new World War II hero would emerge as the new presidential candidate. And that guy would probably be Dwight David Eisenhower. Well, it turns out fate intervenes. Harry Truman is indeed selected as the vice president of the United States. He was not included in the Yalta Conference held between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. That conference was held in February of 1945 to determine the future boundaries of Eastern Europe, as well as to demand an unconditional surrender on the part of Japan. The Russians had still not declared war against the Japanese people. And so England, China, and the United States put forth that Potsdam Declaration. And here is a picture of Churchill, Truman, and Stalin at the conference. Of course, poor Churchill, 1 week into the conference, is replaced by Clement Attlee, and history is what it is. Now, en route back from Potsdam, President Truman is informed that we have tested an atomic weapon. It worked. We had 2 bombs. And probably just as important, we have the capability of making another bomb every 2 weeks. President Truman's decision to use the bomb is sometimes looked upon as one of his most controversial. He made the determination because anticipated losses would be 1 million American and Allied dead and every Japanese citizen as they fought to protect their homeland. General Leslie Gates is who picks these sites. He is the fellow that determined where the bombs would be used. Hiroshima was the headquarters of the Japanese army in the south, and Nagasaki was a major naval port. Now we have the use of the atomic bomb in that sense, we had the capability of dropping another one in 2 more weeks. President Truman intervenes and makes a major decision that most of us never think of. He took the bomb away from the military and placed it under the civilian government. That's why we talk about the president having the launch codes and president having the football and all of these days. Our soldiers have won the war, and now they're anxious to get home. President Truman has the sad duty to inform them that while they've won the war, they can't come home quite yet. They have no house and they have no job. And so although the GI Bill was created under Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman expands it, and it's offering 8 million young people free college. So that many, many young people went off to college. It was not completely fair, especially in the South. Black universities were oftentimes excluded or kept to a minimum, but at least there were some minorities as well as women included in the bill. The GI Bill still exists today in various forms, and it still guarantees mortgages. Looking at Europe, approximately 1 billion people were faced with starvation. President Truman is shown in this photograph with Secretary of State George Marshall, and they are providing food, supplies, rebuilding infrastructure, supplying fuel. Basically, it is a policy to keep the Russians from taking over Europe, but at the same time, this saved 1 billion lives. It was probably America's greatest humanitarian moment. Now imagine, if you will, that President Truman is a chef. He's in the kitchen and every pot on the stove is boiling over. Well, that's about the situation he has. Because while Europe is all facing starvation, at the same time, the Zionists and the Arabs are killing each other in Palestine. President Truman is approached by his former business partner and close personal friend, Eddie Jacobson, his army clerk from World War I. And Eddie is sent basically as an emissary from the World Zion movement to request the President of the United States meet with Dr. Chaim Weizmann of the World Zion movement. And they do indeed meet. President Truman on May 14th, 1948, recognizes the new state of Israel 11 minutes after they declare their independence. At the same time, or at least within a relatively short time, the Soviets have decided that they are going to starve out the people of Berlin. They will take over Berlin, and so they close the Autobahn on the excuse that it is needing repairs, but they also close the railroads, they close the canals, and our military's advice is, well, we could just break through, and President Truman very wisely says that we may get into World War III, and so he comes up with a better plan. The fact that West Berlin had 3 airports, British, French, and American. We landed planes every 30 seconds, approximately 300,000 flights. And in the period of 11 months, brought in 2.5 million tons of food and fuel and saved the people of Berlin from the Soviets. Something that seems hard to imagine President Truman was involved in is that of civil rights. President Truman had been born in the South. He was a bigot as a child, but his experience in World War I, seeing Black soldiers honorably serving along with their white counterparts in many of the colonial nations, changes his opinion. And very sadly, a story of a discharged African-American soldier by the name of Isaac Woodward led President Truman to appoint the very first Civil Rights Commission. And this is the remarkable thing that they asked for. And by the way, the book is called To Secure These Rights. It is in reprint. If anyone would like to read early civil rights history, I highly recommend it. But to secure these rights, ask for the following things: statehood for Hawaii, Alaska, Guam, American Samoa, and Puerto Rico. 2 out of 5 finally got it. It was an end to voter suppression. In the Old South, the most common thing was to hold up a bar of soap and ask how many bubbles were involved in the bar of soap. Well, obviously, no one knows how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, and so no matter what your answer was, it was incorrect. Thus, you could not vote. It was involving Japanese Americans and Native Americans, Mexican Americans, giving them back their rights. We had, in fear, taken away many of these minorities' rights during the Second World War, and so this was an attempt to bring them back into society. And it's not just about rights, racial rights. In New England, whole regions were redlined that neither Catholic nor Jew could buy property. So President Truman has a huge impact on civil rights. Here is a picture taken actually in 1945 that it would appear that we already have integration, but the reality was that integration did not occur in the military services until 1948 by executive order. President Truman did indeed bring civil rights to our military as well as to the federal workforce. And at the Little White House in 1951, he wrote still another executive order requiring federal contractors hire minorities. So he is really far, far ahead of the greater society as far as civil rights go. This cartoon kind of shows us how the public thought. President Truman says, "I stand pat on civil rights," whereas society is saying, "You mean you'd rather be right than president?" So poor Harry Truman was indeed getting slammed as a champion of civil rights. This is an interior shot of the Little White House. People sometimes criticize the president for taking off and going on vacation, just as they do today, just as they've done ever since, probably did before. But in this case, President Truman is using the Little White House much as Camp David is used. Not only was it a place to rest and relax, but it was a point of the government running from Key West, Florida. Truman jokingly said he had a notion to sell everything and just move to Key West. Of course, that never happened, but the greater society understood that the president needed to get away sometimes. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance was signed. Today it is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. It said that if one nation was attacked, all would be attacked, or at least regarded as being attacked. And so it was a mutual defense pact. Of course, we know for a fact that the only time that clause has ever been activated was by the United States following 9/11. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is maintained the peace for 70 years, just as important now as it ever was. Now, this could be an ad for today. As you can see, it says this plan would provide broad coverage to 85 to 95% of the American people. Why is President Truman advocating for national health care? Because 1/4 of our applicants in World War II had failed their physicals. And President Truman felt it was imperative that we have a healthy nation in order to defend itself. So here was a cartoon, if you like, advocating for national health care. The doctors, including my grandfather, fought it tooth and nail. And as you can see, it says, but it has been sugar-coated. It isn't the general welfare pill anymore. We'll just call it the national health pill, socialized medicine. It is amazing that 70 years later, some of the fights that Truman had still are facing our society as a whole. So we do indeed have these struggles continuing. In June of 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea at the instigation of Joseph Stalin. The Chinese had a mutual defense pact with North Korea, and therefore they got sucked into the program. And Truman selected Douglas MacArthur to lead the troops. MacArthur was a brilliant general. MacArthur loved to see his name in print. And quite often he was going to the press. The State Department and Defense Department, by July, only about a month after MacArthur had been named, went to the president and complained that the general was saying one thing. We were saying that the federal government was saying something else. The enemy didn't know what to believe. And so President Truman flew to Wake Island in October of 1950, met with General MacArthur, and after 3 hours of discussion, the general agreed, yes, indeed, the White House must be the sole voice for the war effort. In March of 1951, at the Little White House, the president received a notice that General Ridgway's artillery was working, and so he sent a letter off to General MacArthur stating that he was going to seek a ceasefire. The general got that letter and immediately ran to the press and said he wanted to expand the war into China. So that was the insubordination that President Truman saw, and 10 days later that led to the firing of a five-star general. That controversy still rages today. Was he right? Was he wrong? Based on the number of Chinese citizens that there are, we probably would have lost a war had we gone into war with China. Now, a lot of Americans thought the president had overstepped his bounds. They supported General MacArthur. They were not happy with President Truman's firing of the general. MacArthur came home to one of the biggest ticker tape parades in New York history. He goes to a joint session of Congress and gives his famous "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away" speech. This picture was taken of Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of England, in January of 1952 on board the USS Williamsburg. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read this because it's a long quote and I don't want to get it wrong. "The last time you and I sat across the conference table was at Potsdam, Mr. President, and I must confess, sir, I held you in very low regard then. I loathed your taking the place of Franklin Roosevelt. I misjudged you badly. Since that time, you, more than any other man, have saved Western civilization. When the British could no longer hold out in Greece, you and you alone, sir, made the decision that saved that ancient land from the communists. You acted in similar fashions when the Soviets tried to take over Iran. Then there was your resolute stand on Terrace and your Marshall Plan, which rescued Western Europe, wallowing in the shallows and indeed easy prey for Joseph Stalin's intentions. Then you established the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance and the collective security for those nations against the military mechanisms of the Soviet Union. Then there was your audacious Berlin airlift. And of course, now there is Korea." Winston Churchill seems to have got it. He sensed that Harry Truman would indeed emerge a great leader. Well, it turns out at the time that President Truman left office in 1952, his popularity was 22%. When he had first become president in 1946, his popularity was 86%. So we can see what a dramatic drop this was. I'm happy to report that President Truman lived long enough to see that history does indeed judge everyone. And so before his death, he died in December of 1972, but before his death, he had already floated back up to the top dozen. Today, he is ranked either as our 5th or 6th greatest president of all time. Lincoln, Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, and occasionally Dwight Eisenhower fall before him. But you certainly can see that he has certainly survived the test of time, and that these many, many controversial things that we just covered did indeed impact society and world history as we know it. So I want to thank you for inviting me to come here. I do want to tell you, though, there is one last thing. President Truman was very, very saddened by the fact that he did not succeed in getting national health care. Years later, and I was told this story by Lucy Baines Johnson, so I will relate it with you. In July of 1965, the Johnson family were packing in Washington to go to Independence, Missouri. Lucy Baines asked, "Why would you possibly want to go to Independence, Missouri?" And Lyndon Johnson said, "To make an old man very, very happy." Here is the signing of the Medicare Act, and Harry Truman received card number 1, and his wife received the second card, Medicare system. Again, thank you for coming. I believe Matt is now going to open it up for questions, and thanks for coming and being a part of this webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Very interesting. And we have, as expected, several questions. So I hope you're ready because people are throwing a lot of questions your way.
Sure.
and just a reminder, you can submit questions using the question and answer icon on the bottom of the screen. So the first question is about the Truman White House.
Okay.
Was it his, did he own it before, or was it owned by the government?
It was like Camp David. It was always Navy property. It remained Navy property from 1890 when it was built up until 1974 when the base was de-established. And today it is owned by the state of Florida.
Okay. Okay, so we have that question. And then we have a question from Rita. And Rita wants to know, did Truman take steps privately to prepare for the presidency? He must have known that Roosevelt's health was not good in late 1944 or early 1945.
Because we have such mass media today, we assume that Truman knew things. Truman did not want to be the vice president. He told Roosevelt he wouldn't take the job. Roosevelt called him up and basically blackmailed him into it by saying, if you don't accept the position, we're going to lose the campaign. And so they're off in different parts of the country campaigning. When they saw each other at the inaugural, Truman was somewhat shocked that Roosevelt looked so exhausted and blamed it on the campaign. Yes, in some ways, I think perhaps he knew it in the back of his mind, but he really was not willing to accept that. Roosevelt was building a library at Hyde Park, and that library was going to be equipped so that someone in a wheelchair could access his papers. So Roosevelt thought he was going to live. Truman thought he was going to live. Only in the sense that Truman was so well read, he had background information that normally somebody wouldn't have had, especially someone who did not graduate from college.
How did Truman pull off his 1948 reelection? What was his base? This question is from Kirby.
Truman was probably the only person in America that believed he was going to win. In fact, he was bragging to his staff that he was going to get 313 electoral votes. I think he got 303, so he really did do pretty darn well. Truman understood the concept that all politics are local. And so as he whistle-stopped, as he did this campaign train, he usually would pick a local topic. We get the crowd all fired up on that local issue. And of course, they'd be yelling, "Give him hell, Harry," and on to the next stop he'd go. So little by little, there was a change from September through October. Some of the newsmen were smart enough to see it. But again, too many of them wanted to believe that Dewey was so far ahead, there was no way he was going to lose. And so Truman just knew how to appeal to the common man.
So we have a question from Warren. Warren would like to know, can you comment on the relationship that Truman had with Roosevelt? I believe that it was minimal.
It was indeed minimal. In the 82 days that Truman was vice president, he and Roosevelt met twice. While they were very cordial meetings, Roosevelt didn't feel there was any need to share anything about the government with Truman because he was going to survive. He was going to be around. And I think it probably was his greatest shock to the Roosevelt family as well as to Truman that he died as quickly as he did.
And then we have a few people who want to know what the name of the book was that you mentioned in relation to civil rights.
It is called To Secure These Rights. It is in reprint. I'll warn you in advance. In some ways, if you care, you get very teary-eyed to think that we're still fighting the same fight.
Yeah, I can imagine. Murley would like to know a little bit about how Truman met his wife, Bess.
Okay, that's kind of it is a neat story. Harry Truman and his family, of course, were Baptist. They were out playing in the yard, and a young Presbyterian minister happened by and saw 3 new kids in the neighborhood, went up to Mrs. Truman's door and rapped on the door and invited her to enroll her children in the Presbyterian Sunday school. Harry Truman went, saw this little blue-eyed, blonde-haired girl across the room, and immediately falls in love. He's 6, she's 5. He does not have any success because, frankly, she lived in one of the biggest houses in town. They were the heirs to the Gates Wagner flour mills, and so they never dated even through high school. But upon graduation, he moved to his grandfather's farm about 20 miles outside of town, and so he would make trips into town to visit his cousin. Her name is Ethel Newland. And one day, Mrs. Wallace, that was Bess's maiden name, had sent over a cake, and Harry was quick to return the cake plate and met Virginia Elizabeth Wallace. And every chance he got afterwards, he would make trips next door. He was already 22, 23 years old, and thinking in terms of marriage. Bess turned him down, but they continued to correspond. A lot of love letters sent back and forth. And so just before World War I, Mrs. Truman, future Mrs. Truman, finally says, yes, she would marry Harry. And now he's the one that says we have to wait because he didn't want to leave her a widow. And so as soon as they got back from being overseas on June 28th of 1919, Harry and Bess married. They moved in with his mother-in-law as well as his brother-in-law and his wife. And they had several miscarriages, blaming it on the fact that they waited too long. But they lived with his mother-in-law their entire married life.
Did she ever join him at the Key West White House?
5 times she came. The very first trip she came, she supposedly made the comment that Key West looked like a fishing camp, and she was not impressed. The Navy, in order to make things appear a little better, completely remodeled the house in 1949, and that is the collection we have today. All of the furnishings, well, most of the furnishings are original to that 1949 remodel.
We have a question about that. Can you explain the significance of the poker table at the White House?
Harry loved to play poker. He used it as a team building exercise. It was usually the closest of staff, although sometimes outsiders were invited in. And they would play from like 7:30 until 11. And then the president would take work up to his bedroom and work into the wee hours of the morning. But he used it as a team building exercise. One of his staff members named George Elsie was still living when I first became director. And he said they would throw $20 into the pot as they boarded the plane, and they would play using that same $20 the entire month that they were there. So no one ever lost more than $20 in the game.
Going back to his popularity, you said that it fell to 22%. Gene would like to know why does his popularity fall, and was there fear that he was too liberal, or were they upset about his firing of MacArthur?
I would say it was predominantly over the firing of General MacArthur. Something else that happened, which when we look at it today, you think, wow, this guy has guts. During the Korean War, at the height of the Korean War, U.S. Steel went on strike for 11 months. President Truman felt it was imperative that we have steel to build tanks and planes and trucks and things. And he ordered both sides to call a truce until after the war. Neither side was willing to do that. And the president said, I will nationalize the steel industry. Both sides immediately ran to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled against the president, saying even in the middle of a war, the president doesn't have that much power. But both the unions and management felt he had betrayed them in that decision. So that was one factor. The firing of General MacArthur was a huge factor because the general was very, very popular. Some of it had to do, I'm sure, with civil rights. Some of it had to do with the different minorities that Truman was supporting, but I think those were probably more minimal than the other two items.
Oh, sorry about that, Bob.
I saw your mouth moving, but nothing was coming out.
Several people would like you to comment on the "buck stops here" motto.
Love it. I am very, very fond of that story myself. The president, by the way, received several "buck stops here" signs. The Truman Library always felt that we had one of the originals, but not the original. The original came from a correctional institution in Oklahoma. One of Truman's staffers saw it and thought, boy, that fits my boss to the T. And so he said, can I get one of those signs made? And the warden had one made for, his name's Canfield. But here's the meaning of the "buck stops here." In the Wild West, in a poker game, a bone-handled knife was placed in front of the dealer. It was a marker. It said, this is the guy in charge. If he chose not to deal and not to be in charge, he passed the buck. He passed the knife to the next guy. Then that guy's in charge. And so passing the buck really was a term from a poker game. Truman's a poker player. Truman would know this story. And so they asked the president, well, who do you pass the buck to, Mr. Truman? And he said, the president of the United States can only pass the buck to one person, and that is to God. And so he understood fully that he was responsible for everything. He took responsibility for all decisions, even the controversial ones. And I think on the back of the sign that people never see, is just as important, because it says, I'm from Missouri. Why is that a big deal? And why is it facing him? Don't ever get a swelled head and think you're more important than those you serve, because one day you'll return amongst the people. And so Truman fully understood that as well, that he is honored to serve the people of the United States, but when the time comes, he will be just an ordinary citizen, just as Cincinnatus was in the story of Rome, that he went off to lead the soldiers and then went back to the plow. Well, Harry felt the same way.
We have a few people asking about his daughter's playing the piano. Did she play piano recitals at the White House?
Actually, she did play the piano, but that's not what she's famous for. She went to college to become an opera singer. She was a soprano. And while President Truman was in office, she had a singing career. She appeared on Ed Sullivan's television show. She appeared on various venues around the United States, college campuses and things. And for the most part, the reviews were very, very good. We always know the exception. And the exception came in 1950 at Constitution Hall in Washington. 11 critics were in the audience. Paul Hume from the Washington Post, the music critic, basically said, Miss Truman was flat. She's always flat. And if she wasn't the president's daughter, I doubt she'd ever be asked to sing anywhere. Everyone else gave her favorable reviews. The president was incensed. He wrote a personal letter to Mr. Hume. And the gist of it was, while we've not met, when we do, you'll need beefsteak for your eyes, a new nose, and a supporter down below. He was going to kick his butt. The paper, of course, published the letter, caused all kinds of controversy. Some people even suggested the president should be impeached. Obviously, impeachment has gotten a lot more serious than it used to be. And so after about a week, Truman's own staff said, Mr. President, you got to get this to bed, enough of this. So he went on national radio and said, I have been a father a lot longer than I have been president. That's all the apology you're going to get. Truman, it turns out, was very, very protective of his wife and daughter. No one dared ever say anything bad about them. And Margaret herself, years later, said, well, I was young and my managers felt I needed to strike while the iron's hot. And quite honestly, I probably wasn't that good. She went on to have a very, very successful writing career as a mystery writer. She has something like 38 books to her credit. And Margaret herself died in 2008. Her children are close friends of mine. So we've maintained the family relationship.
Okay, so we unfortunately only have time for one more question. And a lot of people would like to know about, you talked about Churchill's perception of Truman. What was Truman's perception of Churchill?
Truman felt Churchill was brilliant, and he invites him to come to Westminster College in the United States. Actually, what he says is the college invites Churchill to come and give a commencement address, and Truman puts his little note on it and says, if you're willing to come, I'll personally come and introduce you. So Churchill had left office, but he certainly had the support of Truman. And that is, of course, where Churchill gave his very famous Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. So I would say they have had a very, very close relationship.
All right, Bob. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.